Hi, today we're going to talk about a spinning star effect. So this spinning star effect is part of a character test spinning 360 file that Egyptianboy put up, and it's a beautiful animation, and so I'm going to walk through that and explain what he's done through these things. I've already talked with him and he said that was good to do so that people can understand how he did, but you should really check out that link here because it's a very beautiful animation. So this effect is just for having a dizzy kind of appearance, and it's a very nice little animation, and we'll see how he did that. So first you see that he's got a stars group over here, and within it we've got 4 different vector layers. Each layer with an S on it is a star layer, and then the AAA layer is one that has these elliptical curves, and as time goes on they change thickness and tilt a little bit. So first let me turn off the visibility of the other layers and just look at the SSSS layer, and at frame 0 here we just have a star in the middle of the screen. And as we look at the keyframes, notice that there's line width keyframes. Those are needed for the ellipse, but not really needed for the stars. Notice that there's only one keyframe for each one, so really there's no real animation of the line thickness going on, so you could have just drawn that originally without that. So it's not necessary to have any line width changes over time. So I'm using Moho 12, and if you are, you can change the keyframes that you show here in the timeline. So I'm going to go to Timeline Channels, and for the line width, for all of them I have it on auto, but here I'm going to turn off the line width and the selected line width and just click apply. And so we don't need to actually be looking at those, because the interesting part here is what happens to these points. And since we're really manipulating all the points at once, I'll go ahead and turn off the selected point motion, so that we're really just focusing on what's happening to this star as a whole. So now you can see that this is actually a fairly simple animation. We've got a couple of keyframes, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we have a keyframe that cycles back to the first. So on frame 1, if you'll notice, if I click on that frame, we can see that he put the star and it's squashed together a little bit and put a little bit up to the right. Notice how we compare that. And now if we go to frame 4, that keyframe, you can see he's made another keyframe in the middle where it's kind of down a little bit into the middle, so it's kind of swinging in front. And then on keyframe 7, it's over to the left. And then of course on keyframe 10, it's going to be behind. And then on keyframe 12, now notice this is not quite at the end. It's actually going to cycle back to 1. So really 13 will be the same as 1. So this is a 12 frame animation. So every 12th frame will be the same as 12 frames earlier. So frame 1 will be the exact same as frame 13. Notice if I click those, we don't really see any change. Now this is a good point to point out something that's a little bit different in terms of the way that people typically deal with cycles. Notice that this works, but it's a little bit different in the sense that he had to create a frame 12 a position of the star that is just before the final position. And he cycles back to actually 1. The alternative way that you can do this, which is more typical, let me go ahead and duplicate this layer, and I'm going to call this alternate. And now I'm going to hide the original layer. And the way that we do this typically is that, let me go ahead and go to this first keyframe, and I'm going to copy that to the 13th frame. Do a paste. I'm going to get rid of this cycle now, and I can just click and delete it. So now what we have is the first frame and the 13th frame are copied exactly, so you know it's exactly the same. And now I'm going to right click on this and change it to a cycle, And instead of cycling back actually to the first frame, I'm going to cycle back to the frame after the original. Okay? And so that is typically how the cycles are done. We copy the original frame to the wherever we have that restart, and then we cycle back to the next frame after. So that's the typical way that the cycles are done. And so you can see that frame 1 is the same as frame 13. Now frame 2 will be the same as 14, and 3 is the same as 15, for every 12. So that's the typical way that the cycles are done. Now, Egyptianboy did it in a way that still works. He just had to create a frame that was not exactly the same. So an animator, if you're really good at animation, you can do that. But those that are mere mortals, maybe this is the easier way to do that cycle. And of course, notice that the color for the star is different for each of the different layers. Let me go ahead and go here and make sure we show each of the different stars, and you can so each of the stars is a different color. And to do the different stars, he just made a copy of that layer. But here's an interesting thing that you need to pay attention to. Let's now take a look at number 3 here, this layer 3, and I'll show that star. Now if you'll look, it looks like, oh, this is a very short cycle. It's only 4 frames. And if you pay really close attention, you'll notice, oops, where's that 0 frame? And I click on here, and oh, there's something in a negative. So what's going on here? Well, if you haven't dealt with a sequencer, what he has done is dragged these layers, layer 3 and layer 2. Sorry about my window keep popping up. I guess my mouse is a little bit, has double clicking. But he's offset those layers. Now notice what typically you have when you set up a layer is that this little green triangle starts at frame 1, and it's showing you the sequence and when things start. And notice these 2 and 3. Let me go and show the original one. Notice that it begins here at 0, and the animation starts at frame 1. That's what that little green triangle is for. But 2 and 3 are exactly the same kind of animation, but it's offset with respect to this other layer. So each of the layers is slightly offset, giving you this kind of thing where the stars are moving around in a little bit of an asymmetrical type of pattern, and it looks really nice there. And all that it is, if you look here, what we'll see, notice, let me go back to the channels, that this frame here, this repeating frame, is on frame 12. Okay, and if we look at 2, notice it's on 9. So what he did was he slid it back by 3 frames, and on 3 slid it back from 12 all the way to 4. So we went 8 frames back. So how do you do that? You do it on the sequencer, and notice if I drag this, and I'm going to drag from, I'm going to click on 4 so you can easily see it, and I'm going to drag from 4 all the way to 12, and there you go, there's that green triangle. So that's what he did. He dragged from 12. So I'm just, where I want to click, the marker shows me, so I'm just going to start at 12 and drag it back to 4. So that's how he did that. Same thing for 2. If I click on there and go from 9 to 12, see, that's what he did. So he just dragged it backwards. And so that's how you can offset the different layers. Okay, so now let's go back to channels, which is our typical way of dealing with the animations. And let's take a look at the AAA layer. So let's look at that one and hide these other ones. So we can just focus on what he did with these ellipses. And so again, you see this is the normal kind of sequencing. He didn't offset this, and notice that this triangle starts at frame 1. That's all the way it should be. And notice that basically what we have is we just have 2 keyframe changes. And so let me go ahead and turn on some of the other ones, because if we'll notice, we do have changes in the thickness. So I'll go ahead and change those. Okay, so now we see all of the different channels, and notice that we do actually have a number of keyframes that adjust the thickness. So at frame 1, here we see this green ellipse here, and it's thick on the left and thin on the right, and the purplish colored one is thick on the right and thin on the left. In the middle, notice as we're going down, basically we just have the green one tipping down and the purplish one warping. So all he has done is created these 2 keyframes, and then he has a third one that again cycles back to the first one. So that's the kind of animation that's going on with this frame. And so putting it all together, this is the kind of behavior you get. So I hope that was helpful in creating your own little animations, especially with cycles. Have fun!